Welcome back, everyone. Let's get started with our first session of the day. So you want to build a DAO. I'm going to turn things over again to Professor Dan Bonet, who will be moderating this session.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. I'm really looking forward to this panel. This is going to be more of a tactical panel on what is it that you need to do to create a DAO, what are the challenges you're going to be facing, what problems you have to solve in order to create a DAO. And so, yeah, this should be a really, really fun session. I want to remind everyone that we're monitoring the Q&A. So if you have questions for the panelists, please write your questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll be looking at that and asking questions as they come in. So let me introduce our panelists. So we have three fantastic panelists. So let's go around the room one by one. So let's see. So we have Will Papper, who's the co-founder of Syndicate. And actually, before we get any further, Will, could you maybe just explain in like 20 seconds, what is Syndicate and what does it do?
Absolutely. So I'm Will, I'm the co-founder of Syndicate. Syndicate allows anyone to set up an investment DAO. So an investment DAO is a particular type of DAO structure where people are pooling funds with the expectation of profit. And we've set up well over 1,000 investment DAOs to date, which is very exciting and a significant chunk of the total number of DAOs in existence.
Cool. Yeah, excellent. Next, we have Amy Jung. Amy's the former head of community development at MakerDAO. And Amy, again, could you say just a little briefly, effectively, what does a community developer do in an environment like MakerDAO?
Yeah, so a lot of it's a newish role, but in community development, I feel like my role was just kind of bridging together the different stakeholders in the community, including investors, the community members themselves, token holders, and then the workforce itself as well.
So your role was pretty important because the community is actually what makes the DAO, and you were in charge of building the community. So really glad you could join the panel, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation. And then thank you. And then our third panelist is Juan Dulanto, who's from Pleaser DAO. And so Juan, could you maybe explain briefly what is Pleaser DAO? What does it do? How did it get started?
Yeah, so Pleaser DAO is an NFT art collective meets a product studio. We kind of like to call ourselves like the Willy Wonka NFT factory. And basically we collect what we believe to be culturally significant NFTs and other physical art pieces. And then we like to enable collective ownership around those pieces and build on top of them and build communities. A good example of that would be the Doge NFT that we purchased about a year ago that we later went on to fractionalize and open up to a community of holders that could own a fraction of that Doge NFT.
Yeah, and actually, if you look at the collection that Pleaser DAO owns at this point, it's quite an impressive collection already. Yeah. So quite successful. Actually, before we get started, I'm very curious. Can you say a little bit about how big is the Pleaser DAO community? How many people participate in votes and such?
So right now we're currently about 85 members, and we've just been really careful about not opening it up too soon and just kind of trying not to scale too fast. So it's been kind of a private DAO for now. Obviously, I think that the general DAO membership does have the wish to open it up to the public in the future, just not trying to rush that. And we're actually about to close a pretty decent sized fundraise that's going to increase the total member count to around 130 people.
Oh yeah, nice. I see. Great. Okay, so we have we even have an example DAO in Pleaser DAO, and so in this session we're actually going to talk a lot about the mechanics of what does it take to launch a DAO, to run a DAO, and so on. But before we get started, again, I want to just make sure everybody with us is kind of on the same page. So we just had a session about what DAOs are, but maybe each of you could briefly, in your own words, I think it'll be helpful for people to see. Could you just explain very briefly what is a DAO in your mind and why is it such an exciting thing? So yeah, let's start. Will, let's start with you.
Absolutely. So DAOs, as defined in the Ethereum white paper, allow people to manage assets together, vote on how funds should be spent, and upgrade the code of the DAO. That's the textbook definition of the DAO. But I think why DAOs are exciting is one thing that is really important to touch on, which is DAOs, in my mind, are an incredible tool for bringing people together into partnerships and allowing them to coordinate very large groups of people. I was on the core team of Constitution DAO, where in under 5 days, we raised between $40 and $50 million, depending on Ether prices, to be able to place a bid at Sotheby's on the US Constitution. And something like that in the Web 2 world, you would not have been able to do it in 5 days. You would not have been able to do it with the worldwide contributor base that we ended up having. Had we won the auction, we would have all been deciding together where it should be displayed, how it should be displayed, and have this document really be stewarded by a community. We lost the auction, so we refunded the money instead. But the power of scaling up that kind of initiative in just 5 days and then scaling it down when its purpose was finished was something that would be extremely difficult in the Web 2 world.
Yeah, actually, to me, it's kind of it's kind of amazing. Also, this Constitution DAO, which I'm sure everybody in the audience has heard of, although maybe we'll come back to it in a minute just to tell the story. It also had like global participation, right? It wasn't just folks in the U.S. contributing funds to the Constitution DAO. And it's a group of about 20,000 people who in 5 days raised $40 million, right? Or rather, it's a small group who ran the DAO who raised around $40 million from the community, a community of around 20,000 people. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Absolutely. And the community, the core team came together of just different people volunteering their skills. I volunteered to help shepherd them through the Sotheby's bid process, essentially figure out how this decentralized entity with no corporation can actually get cash in hand to show to Sotheby's to be able to place the bid. That was what I focused on. Other people built the website, other people set up the fundraise, other people handled media outreach. And it was a very open, accessible structure for the core team. And then outside of the core team, the contributions were from all over the world, and people could even comment why they were contributing. So there are some people who said, for example, like, my family was descendants of slavery, and now we can govern this document and have a say in how it's presented. Other people were saying, like, I wanted to move to America and never was able to. This is my way of contributing to America's history and culture. It was just an incredible way to bring people together to essentially like take control of this history in a way that's not really possible in traditional museums or in the hands of private collectors.
Very, very interesting. And the fact that eventually the Constitution DAO lost the auction actually does say something about the difficulty of DAOs participating in auctions. And we're going to come back to that later on in the session. So Amy, I'd like to move on to you. So could you tell us what is a DAO and what do you find interesting about DAOs?
Yeah, I mean, we'll give the textbook version. I think I'll give a little philosophical version, which I think DAOs are kind of open network organizations that harness decentralized technology. And when I talk about what open network organizations are, I think there's sort of three main categories. So one, which is it's internet native. I think Ariana spoke a little bit about this, but essentially there's a lot of like network effect behaviors. So the ability to scale really wide is really critical in what DAOs can do. And then there's sort of an encoded execution or set of rules that you can apply. The second one is the ability to self-organize and create checks and balances through mostly peer-to-peer. And then the third one, I think, is multi-party ownership. So not just one company, but multiple stakeholders that are all kind of have different kinds of ownership into a single org.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Makes sense. Great. And Juan, what would you say? How would you define what a DAO is and why you find it interesting?
For me, a DAO is it's an opportunity for people to come together and pool funds and manage funds together in a permissionless and global manner. The way I tend to describe this to like my parents or people that are maybe not as crypto native, it's kind of like a cooperative on the blockchain. And to me, what's exciting about it, and kind of echoing what Will said, I think that, similar to Constitution DAO, something like Free Ross DAO that was birthed out of Pleaser DAO, that was something that from idea to execution took us 7 days. We raised $12 million and were able to bid on and acquire we were able to bid on and acquire the Ross Ulbricht Genesis NFT collection. And I feel like in the traditional world, that wouldn't have been possible, right? Not in that time span, without legal entities, wire transfers, banks in the middle, et cetera. So I think that's what's exciting about it, that it's permissionless, it's global, and it can be set up and executed so quickly.
Yeah, so the speed is like something, the speed at which you can organize a large group of people is something that's very difficult to do, you're saying, in the physical world or even the Web 2 world.
Correct.
And again, the global nature of it is really all you need to do is you just need to have an internet connection, and if you want to, you can participate in these kind of activities. So great. So now let's switch gears and let's talk a little bit about, first of all, not so much yet about how you launch a DAO, but let's talk about why you might want to launch a DAO. So let's say you're a traditional organization. Think of a bank, a hospital, whatever. You're a traditional organization, and you're wondering, maybe we've heard of this DAO thing. Should we become a DAO? How would you answer that question? So Amy, let's start with you.
Yeah, so kind of referring back to this idea of the open network, I think when there's kind of main things, if you're looking for like a higher ratio of contributor to users and kind of bridging that a little bit more, users, consumers, etc., I think there's a really big opportunity there. A second one is when you're trying to create value at scale. And so there's just a larger opportunity. So an example of that is Wikipedia. Instead, sure, one person could create an encyclopedia, but when you have actually a system that allows for the contribution of multiple owners, then you get higher quality as well as wider quality output. And then you see this version in like DeFi strategies today. The second one, which I believe Nathan Schneider is about to talk to as well, is exit to community. So a lot of people, this desire for to share ownership with the people who value the platform. I think we kind of see a little bit of this in Twitter right now, where there's a lot of kind of ownership, a desire for a community to kind of contribute something together. But then instead of a private institution that might want to take over. Other things is I think some people are afraid of sort of like losing market share. So they want to decentralize, but I don't know that is what should be driving your decision to create a DAO.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you brought up Twitter, and that you're saying maybe that should be a community-driven organization, and the way to do that would be, and a DAO is like a natural structure, for that. Of course,
I think you should ask Nathan Schneider, because I think he was involved in that original when Twitter was about to do a takeover. I think that's a really interesting story. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, for sure. Let's see. So Juan, what about you? So what would you say? When should an organization consider becoming a DAO? What are the criteria?
I think that if we're talking about a traditional organization, it's a little tricky, right? I mean, I think the transition from traditional to DAO isn't so easy, or I haven't really seen any super great examples. I think that what we're seeing happening with Twitter, to Amy's point, could potentially be one of the first examples of something like that happening, where Twitter kind of tries to decentralize and potentially have like a token for their community. But besides that, I'm not really convinced or sure that a traditional organization with a traditional legal wrapper and traditional bank accounts, et cetera, should make the transition to become a DAO, unless for some reason that's the vision of the leadership team to make that happen. I think that's tricky.
Yeah, so only do it if really someone is committed to empowering the community, right? Otherwise, if you're already happy with the existing structure that's working well for you, maybe stick with the existing structure. That's your message. That's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, makes sense. One thing that I wanted to stress is that these DAOs really are not kind of just virtual organizations. They can have employees. They can pay those employees. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about what does it mean for a DAO to have a global workforce? Like, there are a lot of challenges in making that happen. So you have experience in actually doing that. So can you say a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, I think there's a common misconception that a DAO, if you work for a DAO, like you can't have operational things like HR and healthcare and pay taxes, etc. But I think that's a misconception, just because I think we saw this development at Maker itself, and that's what the core design of the framework of the organization was meant to do. Because a lot of people have families, they have 401ks, they have, normal things that you would have in your day-to-day. So the way that Maker DAO as an organization works is there's something called core units. And these core units are essentially teams that self-organize and it's permissionless. So anyone could actually propose a core unit, as well as there's an offboarding process for core units. And in this process, it's a proposal, it's a 3-piece proposal that's all on chain. So there is a token vote to then onboard a core unit and offboard a core unit. And in these 3, there is essentially a facilitator who is just someone who communicates with the DAO. There is a mandate that says, like, what's the responsibility of this team? And then the third one, which is what is the budget of that is being requested. And these 3 combined create a core unit, which is essentially a team that is a workforce. And within these, what I found really interesting at Maker is we really saw different kinds of core units formed. So there was one that was like completely crypto native, which is the governance team. The governance facilitator is actually an anon. And so he's not going to, spin up an entity to have employees. And so they are actually quite transparent in the way that they think about salaries and how leveling works and so on. And they pay, they're happy to get, crypto from the protocol straight into their multi-sig and then distribute that multi-sig. And it's just a full end-to-end crypto native process. Then you have companies, you have other core units that already had a company. And so they're essentially kind of contracting to the DAO itself. And they might already have their company structure. And then we have a third kind of middle ground where teams that newly formed to become a core unit to be in this global workforce, they might have distributed team members who is someone in Europe and someone in the US. And so they might have different structures into how they pay each individual, but there's so many services, there are services available today that allows you to then have distributed team members, and you kind of decide the structure of your entity that then is working for the DAO itself. So there's a lot of experimentation there.
And what you're describing here is not theory, right? This is stuff that's actually being used, like Maker is using this, and I guess other organizations?
Exactly. Yeah, and now other organizations, I would say a lot of them are going through similar things, but there's so much more DAO tooling and kind of opportunity for new startups to be, I think Ariana mentioned, like gusto of DAOs and so on. So we're seeing a little bit more of that, but we're not fully formed as they're startups themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. So I see. So the ecosystem is kind of responding to the need for various services like HR, healthcare, and companies that manage that for DAOs are sort of popping up. And I guess we'll talk about the infrastructure for this in just a second. So I wanted to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the tactics of what does it take to actually launch a DAO. Let's talk about specifically what's needed. So as I see it, there are kind of three steps or three critical decisions that are needed to launch a DAO. So the first one is obviously the DAO has to have a vision for what is it that it's trying to achieve, and it has to kind of build a community around that vision. So that's step number one, have a vision and a community. Step number two is you need to have a collection of tools that help you manage the membership of the DAO, right? I mean, folks are sending funds to the DAOs, they're getting tokens. All that has to be managed somehow by a set of tools. Many of those tools run on chain, but you have to decide on which tools you are actually going to use. And then finally, the third component is a very, very big, very important decision in a DAO, which is how is governance done, right? What is the exact voting mechanism? Is governance happening on chain? Is it off chain? What is it that the DAO members can vote on? Can they literally change the protocol completely, or can they just vote on changing parameters in the protocol? So those are kind of the three aspects of deciding to launch a DAO: the vision, the tools to manage it, and the governance mechanism. I want to talk about each one of those in turn. Yeah. So Juan and Amy, let's start with you. So you have a lot of experience in kind of creating a vision for a DAO and building a community for a DAO. So Juan, you actually were one of the creators of the vision for Pleaser DAO, and Amy, you were building community for Maker. So can you talk a little bit about what is it? Where does the vision? How do you come up with a vision for a DAO, and how do you build a community? Yeah. So Juan, in particular, you were involved in Pleaser DAO. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how Pleaser DAO was formed. Where did the idea come from, and what did you do once you had the idea?
Cool. So yeah, I think the vision or the genesis story of Pleaser DAO is a little bit funny in the sense that what Pleaser DAO is today is not what we had envisioned day one. Day one was basically someone tweeted, "Hey, I want to buy this People Pleaser Uniswap NFT piece that's going up for auction, and anybody else want to buy it with me?" And from that one tweet, a Telegram group was created where a bunch of people started to being invited into that Telegram group. And that's kind of how our initial community was built. It was a group of people that together wanted to acquire an NFT that they could not afford by themselves, which today is kind of like a bigger trend that you see everywhere in the NFT ecosystem. So in that point in time, it was a group of people, everybody started contributing anywhere between 5 to 10 Ethereum. All of a sudden we had a pool of funds in Gnosis multi-signature wallet. And once we actually were able to bid on that NFT and win it, which was a very exciting adventure, because along the way we had other people bidding against us and us messaging some of these other people like, "Hey, join us, and like we'll do this together." And like some people ended up joining us instead of bidding against us. And once we had won that NFT, we basically decided to mint a token to represent the DAO and represent governance rights in the future of the DAO, and distribute that token pro rata to the people that had contributed Ethereum. So I kind of like to say that the minimum viable product tools that you need to start a DAO is one, a vision, two, either Telegram or Discord to manage your community, Snapshot to do the voting, and a multi-signature Gnosis wallet. I believe that with those four things, basically anybody can start a DAO. Obviously today there's a lot of other tools that people can use, because you do have to mint and token and distribute it or not, right? There's also DAOs that you're seeing pop up that don't have tokens and have NFTs instead. So that's kind of how we came to be. But ever since then, we've turned into something completely different. At that point in time, we just thought we were all going to chip in and buy one NFT and basically have collective ownership over that NFT. And over time, that's evolved into kind of like I said before, right? Like a Willy Wonka NFT factory, which has been wild. And I don't think anybody had envisioned that day one.
Can you talk a little bit about how you decided who can join the DAO? I think you said there are 85 members. How did you decide who can join and who can't? You must have had many requests for people wanting to join the DAO.
To be honest, in the Genesis day, there was only 35 members, and this was the day of the auction with a few hours to go. So it wasn't this like super organized, polished process with an application. It was literally just like, "Hey, tell all your friends who wants to help us bid on this NFT." So our DAO was born from chaos, right? Like today, like would
like
I do
DAOs.
Yeah, would we do that again? Probably not, right? Like we definitely learned a lot about governance, about token distribution. I mean, there's a lot of negative things that maybe came from that, but we were born from chaos. It was a rush process and I think that's the beauty of Ethereum and the blockchain, right? That these things can happen, and they can happen in a matter of a few hours. In a matter of a few hours, we had collected close to $1 million to bid on an NFT. So, I think that was pretty wild, but it was definitely a chaotic moment that I wouldn't advise people to create DAOs in this way, right? Like it's better to have a more solid foundation and structure on how you're going to govern and what you're going to do, et cetera. But ours was definitely birthed from a moment of chaos, and it's turned into kind of like this beautiful thing that now has a structure and has a lot of more order, and we have like a membership handbook and kind of like all these documents about how we operate and how we govern. But a lot of that came to be over time, and in the moment that we were created, it was literally just like, "Hey, who wants to come in and help us bid on this NFT?" And it just so happened that those first 35 members were, it was just a really good mix of DeFi founders and OG NFT collectors and people that are very respected in the blockchain space. I was just lucky and fortunate to be in the right time at the right place to say yes to somebody's call, and within a 10-minute time window, I ended up in this Telegram group with kind of this really wonderful group of blockchain founders and collectors.
Well, and I think your point about not doing it in chaos is a really important one, in that these days, if you're going to launch a DAO, I think we've learned a lot about how to do it correctly. And these days, if you're going to launch a DAO, you really have to sit down and articulate your vision and who your community is. You really have to decide on the tools you're going to use to manage the DAO, and you really have to decide ahead of time on how the DAO is going to be governed, right? So all those things have to be very, very, very clearly and precisely articulated before you can launch the DAO, and that's how you avoid maybe this launch in chaos as you're describing. So I think we've learned quite a lot, and I think we know how to do it better. One component of that, of course, is choosing your community, articulating your vision to the community, and then growing the community. And Amy, you have a lot of experience with that, so maybe you can talk a little bit about how you've done that in the past, and maybe you can give our audience kind of advice on how they could do it themselves.
Yeah, and just to Juan's point, I think what it reminded me is at that time, everything was still new, like even DAOs, and we were just sort of doing as we were going. And there's a little bit more examples today. And so the model, like mental model I like to use is kind of DAOs is the idea of like startups. You generally understand the difference between how to run a startup and how to run a large corporation. There's clearly some differentiator, but you wouldn't say there's, a hard line between those two things. But you wouldn't really build like a SaaS company the same way you would build a consumer company. That stack of like tools and goals and challenges are just so different. And now we're starting to start, like, I think Juan, like Pleaser DAO really started sort of this idea of a collector DAO, and like kind of formulated this archetype for those types of DAOs itself. Like you said, then that like list of things like Snapshot, multi-sig, I think is a great starter pack for that. I would say if you're trying to start a protocol DAO, it might be a lot more in depth. You're not trying to reach the same goals or speed, etc. So that stack is going to look fairly different. So we're sort of starting to see and like categorize these things. And I'm excited to see more. I think we have just a few actually right now. So we're going to see more as we mature. But back to like the community question, I think no matter what, yes, the vision should be really clear, but I have sort of a different take that I changed my mind on the idea of vision and collective vision. So when I first started, I thought there should just be like one collective vision and everybody should kind of like define that really super clearly and everyone moves towards it. But I think when you're in a fully decentralized organization, I actually think something like a pinecone model works best, which is there's sort of a core center of what is the purpose. So at Maker, like stability, stable coin, these are kind of key values that everyone essentially understands, but everyone's reason of why they're there are quite different. And so you see this kind of discussion in the forums a lot where someone's like, I'm here because I care about something else. And someone's here because they care about, being for the financial like freedom of individuals. And so there's kind of collective visioning that's happening in a decentralized organization. And I think a role of a community development like head is kind of being able to allow people to self-organize around these different visions and kind of connect them through this pinecone model. I would say that's what changed for me, of me thinking there needs to be one vision that's super clear, but I don't think that's actually the case anymore. I don't know the process.
The thing is, if we're gonna pretend like there's gonna be one community with one vision, that's just not how humans work, right? There's always going to be, even within the larger community, there'll be sub-communities that form with different goals and different visions.
Exactly. Just because I think a DAO can get so large and there's such different stakeholders, like someone who is an integration partner is not in the DAO. It's the same reason that a community member who is just super excited is there for, and what they see. I think the a really cool thing about DAOs is that it allows people to bring in these different visions and build towards those different visions. So I would say, like, sure, have some redundancy, allow people to build something slightly different, because you never know what kind of growth that's like part of growing this kind of like pinecone. That's why I call it pinecone. It's like center out. I think that is like a super cool way to, and a community person is kind of managing these different ideas and visions and consolidating it and sharing it and communicating that all at once.
Yeah, fascinating. That's a pretty interesting role to play. So let's see. So I'm going to reiterate my the three kind of steps to creating a DAO one more time, and then I'm going to ask you to talk about the second step. So the first step, remember, is to create a very well articulated vision and the community. The second step is to choose tools for managing membership, and the third is basically to choose how governance work and what it can do. So, Will, you've been developing tools to help manage membership. And you're very well familiar with the tooling for governance. So literally how to actually run the day-to-day operations of the DAO. What is it on the blockchain that actually runs? So could you talk us a little bit through what tools are available today? And maybe even, I think I'm looking at the questions in the Q&A. I think it would be helpful for folks to just even understand what does it mean to deploy a DAO on the Ethereum blockchain, for example? And who does that? Who manage, how do the members actually interact with that contract then? And how does the tooling around the DAO work in general? So you've been doing that for a long time, so I'll let you explain it.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think I'd place the tools in the context of the core tasks of a DAO. If DAOs can modify their own code, i.e. manage membership and ownership, manage assets and conduct votes, there's different tools for each step of that process. So in terms of the core of the DAO, so the DAO's code itself deployed to the blockchain, that often states a few facts. It states who is a member of the DAO, how they gain that membership. Do they put money in? Do they need to be approved? Does the owner grant it to them? And also what abilities that membership gives them. Can they receive distributions? Can they receive refunds? Can they receive access to future drops? A lot of that is encoded on chain. In the case of Syndicate, for example, someone can deposit into a DAO to gain membership in the investment DAO. They can then have access to details about the DAO, like the investments it's made as a result of their membership. And then when it comes time to give out profits via distributions, they can receive those profits back. And that's all encoded on chain. That's secure, that's verifiable. That is something where everyone knows what the ownership is. There's no dispute. Blockchain is a really powerful coordination mechanism in that light. And there's also other tools for deploying these DAO frameworks. For example, Juicebox and Mirror are both used heavily for crowdfunding. In Juicebox's case, you receive tokens by depositing in, but then you can also receive refunds too, which is unique and something that makes a lot of sense for crowdfunding and, for example, makes less sense for an investment DAO. So in Constitution DAO, we use Juicebox because the refund capability was something that we needed in case we did not win the auction. You'll also see custom membership contracts too, like Pleaser DAO deployed their own custom membership contract. They wrote that one from scratch. And these tools tend to have specific approaches for their verticals. For example, Syndicate helps members comply with security laws and incorporates entities. This is unique to investment DAOs. Juicebox and Mirror focus on a lot of crowdfunding related tooling because that's unique to their style of fundraising. So you see these vertical specific DAO frameworks starting to emerge. The second category, we talked about membership management. What about asset management? Asset management is the most common form you see is a multi-signature wallet. Gnosis is pretty much the de facto standard there. Almost everyone uses Gnosis for asset management. And there's a lot of tools that are built on top of Gnosis. So for example, CoinShift and Parcel let you manage the assets in your treasury. For your Gnosis safe, they let you essentially do accounting, things along those lines. Llama is a sort of like asset management consultancy, and they'll help you properly manage your runway as a DAO. Larger DAOs like protocol treasuries tend to use on-chain governance and not multi-signature wallets. But that's because they need a higher standard of security. In the case of Constitution DAO, for example, we had $40 to $50 million in the treasury, and we had 9 out of 13 signers because of the 13 original signers of the Constitution. Anyway, but yeah, we had 9 out of 13 signers. I was one of the signers, and in that case, the multi-signature wallet was based on all of us essentially putting our reputations on the line, saying we will follow the wishes of the DAO. We won't collude to steal the money. We won't go and run off with it. We're going to steward the DAO and serve its purpose. And with Constitution DAO, there were no legal contracts in place. There were no there were no formal agreements. People were donating money. So there was no legal obligation, but there's a reputational and moral and ethical obligation. And a lot of DAOs tend to use smart contracts to not fully replace the legal obligations, but to encode some guarantees. Like in the case of Constitution DAO, the smart contract stated that users would be able to get refunds. That was something that the smart contract stated, and that helped provide more of a guarantee to users. And then, so that's asset management. You tend to see multi-signature wallets for anything under like 100 million. You tend to see a multi-signature wallet. Anything above 100 million, you tend to see protocol treasuries. So how are these wallets governed? So there's a bunch of different governance tools. So for multi-signature wallets, they're doing off-chain governance, and then the signers execute it, which means that you're often using Snapshot, as Juan mentioned, which allows you to vote off-chain, but in a verifiable way. Or some groups, smaller DAOs, even use token-gated Discord or Telegram channels. So you tend to see small DAOs using group chats, mid-sized DAOs using Snapshot, and then large DAOs using on-chain governance via Italian Boardroom. These large DAOs are the ones that are not using multi-signature wallets. So instead of people telling the multi-sig signers what they should do and having the multi-sig signers execute, the largest DAOs, people are directly stating on-chain what transactions should take place. This is the most secure, most verifiable way to run a DAO, but it has corresponding problems. If you set, for example, a threshold of votes too high, you could end up not having any votes get through and funds being permanently locked. If you set a threshold of votes too low, someone could steal the money by sneaking in a vote that essentially states that they should receive all the money, and if no one notices and it passes, then all the money is stolen. So multi-signature wallets are good for smaller DAOs because they act as a human check. People can make sure that things are being executed according to the community's wishes. Larger DAOs with more money at stake, on-chain governance is often a better fit because there's more people watching the on-chain governance, and you have a lot more participation there in the voting process.
On-chain governance also has higher gas fees involved, right? Everybody has to pay for voting.
Yes. So one thing you'll see, and Maker has an excellent process for this. So Maker, for example, has a. Amy, I might be butchering some of the nuance here, but Maker has essentially a process where you do a quick vote on a forum, essentially a signal vote. You just state your opinion, and that's not based on your token holdings. That's just to get a general pulse of the community. And then you do a snapshot vote, which is an off-chain vote, and that's free. There's no gas required, but you are signing with your wallet. So you are verifying that you have the holdings that you have. So it's a higher standard of security, but also a little more time consuming to do. And then on-chain votes are usually the third step in the process, or multi-sig transaction execution, depending on whether you're using a multi-signature wallet or on-chain governance. And in the on-chain version, you then pay gas to vote, and it often costs like tens or hundreds of dollars. So a lot of people don't. So you tend to see pretty steep participation drop-offs with each step. So this is one really important thing about DAO tooling, is that the tooling you choose also dictates how many people participate. If you're running polls in a token-gated Discord, that's less secure to some extent. Discord is not a decentralized network. Discord is not verifying your wallet holdings every time you're running the poll, but it's also easier to use and you get more participation. If you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, on-chain governance, you have something that's really secure, really verifiable, but also at the same time, it's harder to use. Over time, this usability gap will be reduced, and my hunch is that we'll see more and more people move to on-chain governance. But right now, it's essentially a trade-off between how many people do you want to participate versus how secure do you want it to be.
So hopefully, as the chains scale and gas fees come down, we'll see much more on-chain voting, because that's actually the main stumbling block to on-chain voting these days. Yeah.
Yes.
And so as things scale, hopefully we'll see a lot more on-chain voting. And as you say, that's probably the kind of the gold standard of how to account for what the community actually wants to do. Yeah.
Right. And there's currently like a definitional debate in the DAO community over whether multi-signature wallets count as DAOs. People who are maximalists in the definition of DAOs, they focus a lot on the modify their own code part of the definition and basically state if DAOs are not modifying their own code on chain, they're not true DAOs. They if they're managing assets and conducting votes but not modifying their code, according to the Ethereum white paper, they're not a DAO.
Yeah.
The other camp says that DAOs are these community primitives. DAOs are ways to bring people together. Multi-signature wallets are a acceptable way to run a DAO, especially since on-chain governance also comes with its own risks. So sometimes you'll see people state like, this is like a true DAO or this is not a true DAO. That's the heart of the controversy of the community is in right now over whether a multi-signature wallet with off-chain governance counts as a DAO or whether it needs to be on-chain governance with on-chain voting.
Yeah, great. That was actually a wonderful survey of all of the tooling out there, right? So there's a bunch of tools for membership management that you went through, a bunch of tools for asset management, although Gnosis is pretty much the kind of what a lot of DAOs use, and then there's a lot of tools for actually managing the governance process itself, managing the votes and so on, whether it's off-chain, on-chain, or through delegation. So actually, the fact that we actually are talking about governance now is good, because I do want to talk a little bit about how to actually do governance in a DAO. This is a very important decision when you launch a DAO. How do you want it to be governed is kind of a critical decision for how the DAO is gonna evolve. So I was hoping you could all three tell us a little bit about the different steps of deciding on governance. I guess the first step is who's allowed to vote, right? People who are allowed to vote are generally people who hold the DAO token, right? So there's this question of how do you distribute the DAO tokens to begin with, right? So the DAO launches, there's a bunch of DAO tokens that are created, and they have to be distributed to members of the community somehow. So can you talk a little bit about how token distribution has worked in the past? How would you like to see it work in the future? There's a lot of questions about inclusion and equality and such. So maybe you guys can whoever has the most experience with this, can you guys chime in? Amy, do you want to go first? I think you have a lot of opinions on this.
I feel like I feel like I've spoken a lot, so I want to let Will start.
Oh, okay, Will, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, sure. So one thing that I think is under-discussed in the DAO space is governance frameworks. So governance frameworks essentially state how a DAO, how the voting process of a DAO works. Where do you discuss proposals? How long are those proposals open? How many people need to vote for a proposal to be considered valid? And governance frameworks are really, really important. I was closely involved in the Loop community. The Loop community was essentially an on-chain fantasy game that people were building on top of. And in the Loop community in the early days, there was no governance framework. So there were simultaneous votes being conducted that said opposite things, and both were winning. This is, of course, a hard situation to be in, especially hard when you are using, for example, a multi-signature wallet, and a human needs to figure out what should go on at the end, and how to execute those requests. So governance frameworks are probably the most important thing before you launch your voting process. And it specifies a lot about this. Another thing that I think that Juan will have a lot of really interesting thoughts on is token distribution. A lot of DAOs do an initial token distribution, and then they're kind of stuck with it. And it's really hard for them to evolve and change over time. So thinking about the initial token distribution for your DAO and preserving flexibility for yourself in the future is really, really important. There's many DAOs, for example, where people who just happen to be involved early have far more tokens than the people who actually work for the DAO, which does seem like misaligned incentives. And token distribution is another absolutely key task.
Yeah, so how did you
Do you want to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Amy. Yes, absolutely, for sure.
Oh no, I'd love to hear Juan's.
Yeah, Juan, go ahead.
Token.
Yeah.
So regarding token distribution, yeah, I mean, I agree with Will. I think it's a huge issue in the industry, right? And I think kind of the ongoing joke amongst DAO operators is that sometimes DAOs turn into kind of like that high school or university work group where one person's doing all the work and carrying the whole group and everybody else is just kind of slacking off. And yes, that tends to happen. And, you know, kind of akin to Web2 startups, where some startups have to eventually unscrew their cap table, for lack of better words. I think that also happens to DAOs, right? And I think Will hit the nail right in the spot, as far as it's something that a lot of DAOs in the early days are not really thinking about. And as they start scaling, they're going to be forced to think about it. And I think we're kind of in a situation like that, right? Where a majority of your cap table or a majority of your token supply is potentially in the hands of the people that love your DAO but don't have the bandwidth to become day-to-day active contributors. So, you know, I think that's an ongoing problem that we have to try to figure out. Like I said earlier, right? Our DAO was born in a moment of chaos, but I think that if we could start all over again, you would think about a lot of these things, right? You would think about the tokenomics. You would think about reserving a, you know, kind of like Web2 startups reserve like a stock option pool. DAOs should be doing something similar, right? They should be reserving some percentage of the token supply to go to future core team members and contributors, etc. So it's a lot of things that I think we're learning on the go. Unfortunately, there's not really a playbook for operating, creating, and running a DAO. And I think, you know, the reason why, you know, the people on this call are on this call is because we're all figuring it out along the way. And something that I love about the space is that people are very open about sharing kind of like their lessons and in an effort to try to move the space forward and to get more people to adopt these technologies and to get more people to adopt what we're doing here as far as building and contributing to DAOs.
Well, there's actually definitely a lot of room for experiments in the space, right? So every DAO that launches is in some sense an experiment in how to run a DAO properly. And then we get to see whether the DAO actually works well or not. And if it works well, the rest of the community can learn from that success and adopt and take the successful pieces and absorb it into their own DAOs. So yeah, Amy, you have a lot of practical experience with governance. So where do you see this token distribution question? How do you address it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when we were kind of going through these challenges at Maker, we were kind of like, we didn't have too many other peers that we could ask about how they were managing these things, but kind of talking to DAOs today that are going through like a transition of like decentralizing more, I realized there are things that are consistent with the challenges that we had at Maker. So I think the playbook is coming soon. It's just, like I said, for specific things. With governance related things, I really want to give a shout out to Long for Wisdom, who is the governance facilitator at Maker. And there's on Mondays, he gives like anyone could come in and ask like Maker related governance questions, which I highly recommend. But in general, something I think about is the idea of like power and influence. So I define power as the ability to like veto an idea. So most of these are like large token holders, you know, just the ability to stop something or start something. And then I think of influence as the ability to have like a following. So in the context of Maker, you have core facilitators who are the ones that people trust as like the level of expertise to kind of lead something. And I don't think that we should understate that influence part. There's a lot of people are more influential than they have power. So then it's thinking about like, how do you redistribute that power by, you know, through token distribution. I think there's something with delegates, paying delegates, but also giving them MKR. So then they're kind of like structuring a little bit of the earlier distribution that might have been for if you only had money to buy something, or if you were only known something in the early days. I would love to still join Pleaser DAO, so I'm sending my membership on. But like I wasn't super aware of like the Telegram chat or things like that. Like how do you redistribute that in once you already start a governance process? And I think that's what Will was alluding to, like that is hard to do. So if you think about it a little bit earlier and just think about how you want your governance to be around what you're trying to govern, that's a really great starting point. I don't think we have a lot of frameworks, but there are things that we've seen in like cooperative models, just existing models that exist in today's society, like Web 2, I don't think it's exclusive that those governance models only work in a Web 2 context. I think we can look at governments and different ways to organize.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, maybe we get to a point where so many governance experiments are running in DAOs that maybe even the real world will learn about governance from how governance is done in DAOs. This is such an amazing platform for experimenting with governance that I'm sure there's a lot to be learned from it. Also, real corporations and real governments can probably learn from how all these DAO experiments over time. So we actually have a lot. We're actually starting to run short on time, and there's actually a very big topic that I wanted to cover before we open it up for questions. I did want to mention, by the way, that I think it's like tomorrow we're going to have an entire panel devoted to the different types of governance. Is it one token, one vote? Is it one member, one vote? Is it people who vote for proposals that get very low yes votes, so they get penalized for voting for those proposals because likely they're harmful? So there are lots and lots of questions about governance, how to run governance properly, and we have an entire panel devoted just to doing to this question of how should governance actually work. And there are even political scientists on that panel because they have a lot to teach us, given that humanity has been struggling with governance for almost its entire existence. But before we open it up for Q&A, I want to switch gears and talk about a completely different topic, which is the privacy aspect of DAOs. Yeah. So as we said, DAOs are managed on a blockchain. Basically, everything in the DAO is open. Yeah, people can read the state of the contract on the blockchain and see what the size of the treasury is. If there's on-chain voting, people can see what the proposals are, and they can see exactly who voted for what. They can see, who contributed to the DAO and how much they contributed to the DAO. They can see who the members of the DAO are. If the DAO is paying salaries to employees, everyone can see exactly how much those employees are being paid. So your salaries are public. So there's a lot of privacy issues when you run a DAO on the chain. And I kind of wanted to, first of all, I wanted to flesh that out, that it's important to understand that there is an issue with running DAOs completely in the open on chain. And I kind of wanted to throw it back to you guys and say, what if you had your pick for what should be made private in a DAO, what do you think should be made private? And actually, Will, I'll start with you, and maybe you can quickly explain to our audience, why is it that Constitution DAO lost the auction?
Yeah. So I would love to hide how much each member deposited. And the reason why is because in the case of Constitution DAO, so every single deposit was public, which meant that that's the upside of the DAO. There's transparency. The downside of the DAO is that transparency is bad when you're trying to participate in an auction where every other party's possible bids are private. So prior to the auction taking place, we got word from some people who were closely involved in the collector scene that there were about half a dozen people with pretty substantial pockets who were interested in the Constitution. And we expected to have about half a dozen other bidders. We raised $40 million. And then when we actually got to the auction, there was only one other bidder left. So we knew that because our total amount was public, that had caused 4 of the 6 total bidders to drop out, and that there are only 2 left. The downside of our amount being public is that meant that the one who was left was willing to pay more than we had, because they knew how much we had available. So we essentially went through the bid, and we lost. And I mean, going into it, for the eventual winner was Ken Griffin, founder of Citadel, like Ken Griffin knew how much we had available to bid. We didn't know how much Ken Griffin or anyone else had available to bid. So we're coming in at a disadvantage because our information was public and everyone else's information was private. I think this is also an area that DAOs in general need to think about. And I know that Amy has a very thoughtful perspective on this, is at what points are DAOs being at what points is the community and transparent nature of DAOs an advantage, and at what point is it a disadvantage? We definitely could have used better DAO privacy and Constitution DAO. I think in that case, the amount raised was a disadvantage.
How about this question of how much did each member contribute? Is that something that you think is important to keep private, or can that be public?
That's a hard question because, well, okay, so there's a few layers that'll peel back. One is that, so there's a risk of governance capture in any DAO. Governance capture is when one party or a small number of parties that are colluding can control greater than 51% of the governance. So in theory, a lot of DAOs actually mitigate this in practice, but in theory, the holders of 51% of the tokens could say, we're going to give ourselves all the money. And by owning 51% of the tokens, they can actually steal 100% of the funds. In practice, this is usually not the case. Maker has a poison pill that prevents this, but in theory, this is possible. So my first order answer is, it's good to have the amount that each person has deposited to be public, because that ensures that there's some sense of the risk of governance capture. But then the second order answer is, it's also trivial to create multiple identities on the blockchain. It's what's known as a Sybil attack, where essentially you can create lots and lots of identities and essentially obscure who's a real person, who's not. So if an entity wanted to obscure the fact that they had governance capture, they could just spread out their tokens among hundreds or even thousands of different wallets, and no one would know the difference. So hiding how much each member deposited is good for auction scenarios. It has some implications on transparency around governance capture, but because governance capture is already not terribly transparent in the first place, I think it's definitely worth the trade-off, and that it is better to hide how much each member has deposited than to reveal it.
Yeah. And Juan, I mean, taking it to you, so you run Pleaser DAO. Your discussions are on, what did you say, Telegram or Discord?
Currently on Telegram.
Telegram, yeah. So your discussions are not particularly private, in the sense that it's probably not that hard to join your Telegram group and see what you're discussing. So, but at the same time, you guys are participating in auctions. And so people who are bidding against you can see exactly what you guys are thinking in your head and take that into account when they're doing their own bids. So how do you reconcile the issue that, you know, by definition, DAOs, you know, they have to make decisions jointly. That's what a DAO does. And yet that actually opens them up to potential attacks from people competing against them, against those DAOs.
Yeah, so just to clarify, our Telegram is token gated, so it's only if you're a member can you be inside of the Telegram. But to answer your question, you know, I think it's tricky in the sense that our Genesis story, that acquisition of the People Pleaser NFT, the fact that it was all public, how much money we had raised, actually did the opposite of Constitution DAO in the sense that it worked in our favor, because it ended up scaring off other bidders. But we got lucky in that sense, right? I think that up to this point, anytime we've decided to acquire a new piece, we usually have a governance proposal with what do we want to acquire, why do we want to acquire it, and what's the max bid we're willing to pay for it. Now, as we've started to scale, the fear comes of what happens if that information starts to leak, right? So in regards to privacy, in my opinion, I think that if it could have a detrimental effect to your strategy, you have to figure out a new mechanism or process to keep some of this information private. And some of the things that we've discussed internally is to anytime we want to acquire a new piece, we're still going to do a governance proposal on what we want to acquire and why we want to acquire it. But the actual piece of the max bid, we will most likely set up a task force or a pod of elected 2 to 4 individuals that will manage that max bid process and will not share it with the rest of the members. And that's just to, you know, not lose that strategic advantage of stuff like that leaking. Unfortunately, in the case of Constitution DAO, it was the DAO that was assembled just to acquire one piece, right? And for us, any new piece that we decide to acquire, we're more than likely not going to use our entire treasury to go after it. So people can look on chain and be like, oh, Pleaser DAO has $35 million in their wallet, but it's usually kind of tricky. You know, it's like a lot of this stuff we're going for nowadays is not going to be valued anywhere near that high. So I think this process of basically having a task force or a pod that contains that information around the max bid and executes on it is a better solution than what we have right now, where it's the governance proposal goes fully live.
But nevertheless, Juan, I mean, it sounds to me like what you're saying is that there's really an opportunity in that we need better tooling for managing DAOs, and that better tooling should also take privacy into account, right?
Absolutely.
Privacy for the treasury, privacy for discussions, privacy for governance, and so on. So there's actually an opportunity here to build better tooling for DAOs that preserve that think of privacy from day one. So actually, we're running a little bit low on time, but it's really, Amy, there's a question that I really have to ask you, and then I'll do maybe one or two Q&A questions. So one of the issues is that everything that the DAO does involves governance, right? People vote on what the DAO does, and that takes time. But there are some situations where a DAO has to respond to an emergency, as you have had experience yourself, where a DAO basically, market behavior became unfavorable, and the DAO had to pull an emergency switch to shut itself down before things get out of hand. So how do you reconcile the need to handle emergencies with the need for everything to be voted on? I mean, the two kind of seem to be in conflict. And how do you deal with this?
Yeah, so there's actually two parts to the question. So there's one, which is Maker has an emergency shutdown process and module. So that's specifically in the case of what you see, the MKR, like essentially token holders have the ability to like completely shut down the protocol. And we've seen where it got very close to that, but we never actually had to use it. Then the second piece, which is about voting. So I think with governance, it's interesting because there's something called the dark spell. And the dark spell is for if there's like something in the code that is like essentially hackable or there's kind of risk to it. There is a process, again, governance process, in which how to handle that to create where the smart contract developers and with trusted parties can deploy and kind of bring up a solution, a potential solution to fix that in a dark way, which is without revealing exactly what it is, who it is, and so on. And part of that escalation process is that the core facilitators do have the ability to create emergency signals. So if there's something that needs to be escalated, they have the ability to do an emergency signal, deploy that contract, and then there still needs to be a vote on it, but it's just essentially a lot faster process than it is with like a regular cadence. And so when an emergency happens, I would say people in the DAO are pretty connected to large token holders, and the growth team and so on have really made a lot of relationship building just to manage those relationships in case there is an emergency where something has to be deployed. They know like they can communicate as soon as possible to deploy that solution.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really, really good point to remember, that no matter what we do, not everything can be done via large scale votes. There always has to be some community, some small set of governors, as you facilitate. What did you call them?
Unit facilitators.
Facilitators, that's right. That can manage things in case of an emergency without doing a large scale vote to make a decision. So again, this is important to keep in mind when people are designing new DAOs. Great. So let's see. Oh boy, we're a little bit over time. Maybe we can do one or two questions in 2 minutes, and then we'll take a break. Are you guys up for it? Yeah. Great. Let's do it. So let's see. So some questions. One interesting question that came out is, how do you measure success of a DAO? How do you define a successful DAO? Anyone?
I mean, I think that depends on the vision and the purpose of the DAO, right? And kind of unfold from there, particularly.
I think one way I'd reframe the question is, I think like one thing we'll start to see more of is more ephemeral DAOs. A lot of DAOs on Syndicate are structured to purchase a particular asset. Constitution DAO is structured for a particular purpose. So I think that instead of seeing these like DAOs as a very amorphous category that kind of try to do lots of things, we're going to start to see DAOs that are very specific, trying to do one thing, and they either achieve it or they don't.
Yeah, I see. And if they achieve it, then they're successful. If they don't, then they're not, obviously. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Great. And then maybe one last tactical question, and then we'll call it a day. Yeah. So some people have asked on the Q&A, if you were going to launch a DAO today, which blockchain would you recommend launching on? Is that a touchy question, or we don't have to answer it? But that did come a couple of times across in the Q&A.
ETH maxi here, so that's my answer.
Okay, Ethereum, yes.
So I'm personally not an Ethereum maximalist. I'm an Ethereum virtual machine maximalist. I believe that anything that can run Ethereum's code is a good place to launch a DAO, whether that's Ethereum, Optimism, Arbitrum, Avalanche, Polygon. Syndicate is on Ethereum mainnet. We're deployed to Polygon and operating on shortly, and we'll have Optimism and Arbitrum soon. So my attitude is, as long as it runs Ethereum's code, it's a good place to start DAO.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Amy, did you want to take a shot at this, or?
Yeah, I'm also personally an ETH maxi, but I will say we're starting to see blockchains that will have specific use cases for specific blockchain needs. I think Ethereum is just the most mature in the state, so that's why I'm an ETH maxi. But I'm very open to the idea that there could be different needs for specific blockchains.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I see. We're seeing some special purpose blockchains. Maybe if your DAO fits that community, maybe that's something to think about. That's a great answer. Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to stop here. So thank you all so much for doing this. This has been a super informative panel. I hope our audience got a sense of all the tools and all the issues around launching a DAO. So thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And Kristen, I'll hand it back to you.